Okay, so a little bit of advice. We are halfway through the class, halftime, if you will. In a football game or a basketball game, they have half times. Coaches pride themselves generally on their halftime adjustments. Just this past week, Chris Peterson, the head coach at the University of Washington, was criticized because his halftime adjustments are not very good. So, if you're not doing as well as you hoped you would do in this class, time for a halftime adjustment. Change of strategy. So, if I could see my other slide here regarding one definition of insanity. I didn't make this up, by the way. You just kind of fit with what I'm talking about. Doing the same thing while expecting different results. No, you need a halftime adjustment, a different strategy, and then perhaps you can expect different results. So if you've decided at the beginning of the semester that you'd get the class done without reading, I understand. There's a lot of classes you can do that. This isn't one of them. So you have to do the reading. Perhaps you decided you could skip every other class. I understand. A lot of classes you can do that. This isn't one of them, as I explained on day one. Time for an adjustment. So go to the study session. Read harder. Read more intelligently. Pay attention to what I'm saying is important, because it's important. Let's look at the quiz question. I'll give you an example. So on the very first day, and in the syllabus, I said it was essential to understand what concerning wars? Causes and results. Am I a man of my word or what? There it is. What was the basic cause of the War of 1812? And with whom did the United States fight that war? The Second War of Independence, right? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about the War of 1812 today. You read about it, so all this is going to be reinforced. You already know what to look for, what to concentrate on. Second question, we also know that people who have had a tremendous impact on American history are by definition important, not irrelevant. So who is this? Andrew Jackson leaps off the pages. By the way, I'll help you out with your change of strategy in case you need it. And by the way, Elizabeth, I wouldn't change anything. But if you're in need of a change of strategy, this will help you a little bit. Here's a default answer for the next 3 weeks until the next test. When in doubt, write down Andrew Jackson. He dominates the era. Andrew Jackson. Oh, let me see. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson. Everybody with me. 1, 2, 3. There we go. You're probably going to get some points even if it's not exactly right. Okay. The War of 1812. It is September 1814. The War of 1812, math majors, has been going on for how long? 2 years. This is one of those great wars. You get the date and the name of the war all in one. It's not like the 7 Years' War where you got to remember 2 different names. This is like heaven for history students. War of 1812. You know, a similar question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? All right, this is as funny as I get. You want to encourage me, right? The war has been raging for 2 years. The British, having defeated Napoleon, albeit only temporarily, have decided now, since the French are defeated on the continent, to focus all of their attention on the United States. Up until this time, we've been getting something of a pass. Because again, this is a world war, the War of 1812. And our part of it is just one small theater of it. 3 British armies are converging on the new republic, one in the north, one in the middle, on Chesapeake Bay, and one is headed for New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So the British, for all practical purposes, are attempting a pincer movement of surrounding the United States. Indeed, the British Army on the Chesapeake in the middle has already attacked and burned Washington, D.C. Yes, the national capital. Taken, gone. President Madison barely escapes capture. The militia defenders, and we all know about militia. The militia defenders of the capital did not fight well. There's a shocker. They scattered like so many sheep in front of the British regulars, the redcoats. Having dealt with Washington, the redcoats returned to their ships and sailed north to attack Baltimore. The British were confident that their fleet could destroy Fort McHenry, which was the fort that protected Baltimore. But this time, American soldiers fought well. They did not scatter into the night. Indeed, the battle raged into the night. Now, there was an American lawyer who had gone on to one of the British warships to negotiate for the release of an American prisoner of war. And from his vantage point on board that British ship, this lawyer, Francis Scott Key, watched the artillery duel between the guns in the fort and the British guns on the ships. In the darkness, bombs bursting in air illuminated both the fort and the ships as they burst. And American and British soldiers as they fought. Key now is watching this death struggle from the British ship, and he's moved to write a poem, hoping to inspire other Americans with words and with what he saw that night. Brave Americans, refusing to give up when they were overmatched against the greatest navy, the greatest military power in the world. The British, of course, were confident of victory. Their ships moved back and forth in rhythm, firing incessantly on the tiny fort. Who could prevail against such power? Nevertheless, the Americans, apparently unaware of their inferiority, of their impending doom, fought on. And every so often, the rocket's red glare told Key that the American flag over Fort McHenry was still there. Then, in the dawn's early light, Key caught a glimpse of the flag's broad stripes and bright stars. There was no British Union Jack, the British flag, flying over Fort McHenry. There were no red-clad soldiers climbing over the ramparts. There were no "God Save the King" cheers coming from British ships. Baltimore was saved. Fort McHenry still stood in American hands. But the war was far from over. It's just a battle. And of course, Key did not know that that poem that he wrote would go on to become the national anthem. What does it say about Americans that the vast majority of us could not possibly, to save their lives, explain where the poem, the song, came from? Well, the British Army on the Chesapeake, having failed to take Baltimore now, got back on their ships, and they were ordered to proceed out to the Atlantic and then south around Florida to join the British invasion force that was going to take New Orleans. The origins of the war. What was the cause? We'll back up and start at the beginning now. The origins of the War of 1812 have more to do with the war between the British and the French than it does between the British and the Americans. The war between the British and French for world supremacy had commenced again in 1793, 20 years before. And then it morphed into the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon became dictator of France. So this war has been going on pretty much the entire time of 20 years. So again, we're just a small side stage. And this war is being waged with great fury. Both Great Britain and France now adopted policies that resulted in interference with American shipping. Neither side wants American goods to be shipped to the other side. It makes sense. That makes the other side stronger and more capable of fighting the war. And so if you can, if you're the French, you want to stop goods going to Great Britain, and vice versa. It's very simple. The Americans, on the other hand, and other nations like America, stand for the idea of neutral rights. We're not involved in the war, at least not before 1812, and so we insist on the right of trading with whomever we want. Get out of our way. It's the seeds of a conflict. And this would be the basic cause of American entry into the war, the right to trade with other nations, in spite of a raging war. And this cause, even when the War of 1812 is over, does not go away. In fact, this is the basic cause of American entry into which war? 100 years later. Yeah, thank you. The Great War, the First World War. Same issue, same primary cause. Okay? So it's a major issue between nations. You have to understand this to know how the world works. So, both the British and French determined to stop American trade with the other side. In addition, and now the British have the greater navy, so the British are able to interfere with our shipping on the high seas far more than the French can. And when the British stopped American ships and seized their cargoes, they also looked for deserted British sailors. Serving on a British warship during a war like this is not a pleasant experience. And it also generally leads to a relatively short life. And so when these British warships would put into port, sometimes these sailors would desert. And being sailors, well, what do you do for a living? You have to do something, and so you would sign on board another ship of some kind, some other nation or what have you. Now the British during the war are looking for deserted sailors. And they've gone to the great trouble of creating great long descriptions and then having them copied by hand and placed on every British warship of the deserted sailors. And of course, the penalty for desertion in the middle of a war in the British Navy, and any Navy for that matter, is what? Death. They take you to if they catch you, they take you to the nearest British warship out in the harbor, and they put you out on the yard arm, that is the cross spar that holds the sails, and they hang you in front of the fleet and all the other ships there in the harbor, as an example. There you go. And as the British now invaded American ships, they were not very particular about who they grabbed off those ships. You could be an American citizen with a strange accent and a funny look and a scar in the wrong place and the wrong color hair, and you're a British deserted seaman, and off you go. This is called impressment. They're pressing these men into service on a British ship, and most of them are going to be hanged. So that is the second issue, impressment. But still, it's interfering with these neutral ships, you see. And then finally, out on the frontier, the American people continued to move west, and they came into conflict with the Native Americans out there, of course. And these Indians often sought help from whomever would be willing to help them, and so British traders, generally coming down from Canada, oftentimes sold goods, weapons, whatever, to these Native Americans. And the American people were absolutely certain that these British traders were inciting the Native Americans to attack American settlements. And so you've got trouble out on the frontier as well. At this time, an Indian leader by the name of Tecumseh had unified many of the tribes. He was a great Native American leader, Tecumseh. And a lot of Americans had a lot of respect for Tecumseh because he was such a powerful speaker and such a charismatic leader. By July 1812, President Madison gave up trying to negotiate a settlement with the British and asked Congress for a declaration of war. We're just tired of it. Ironically now, the British had just decided to meet Madison's terms. No war necessary. We all know it doesn't go that way. Madison might have stopped the war once he got the message from the British, but he knew that next week, next month, the British could change their minds again. And so he decided not to stop the war. He decided that the Redcoats would have to be taught to permanently respect American rights and American lives, both on the ships and on the frontier. Now, Andrew Jackson, in writing about this war later on, described the causes of the war. And I don't want you to try to write this down. That's why I didn't put it in the note guide. But you can put, if you want to, in a little box of your own, Andrew Jackson and the causes of the war, but just listen. We're going to fight for the reestablishment of our national character, self-respect, pride. Misunderstood and criticized at home and abroad. We're going to fight for the protection of our sailors, impressed on board British ships of war and compelled to fight for our enemies against ourselves. We're going to fight to uphold our right to free trade and open a market for the produce of our soils, now rotting on our own hands, because the mistress of the oceans, Great Britain, has forbid us to carry them to any foreign nation. In short, we are going to fight to seek revenge for past injuries, some security against future aggressions, by the conquest of all the British territory in North America. And that would primarily be Canada. Conduct of the war. In the War of 1812, American forces planned to capture Canada, a British possession, because it was about the only way that the United States could inflict damage on the British Empire. We are not going to get in a bunch of ships and cross the Atlantic Ocean and invade London. Why? Because we don't have those ships. We don't have the power to do that. But we can march north and invade Canada and inflict harm that way. And of course, Americans believed that Canadian lands would one day enrich them, so that would be a reward. But after 2 years of fighting, the war for Canada was a stalemate, not going our way. Now on the seas, American warships, and we have a few, we hope to attack British merchant shipping and molest the occasional isolated British warship. American seamen were more successful than our ground forces were against Canada, but that's largely because our efforts against Canada were a dismal failure. The bar for success is low. American ships such as the USS Constitution won some face-to-face engagements with single other British ships. But this only made the British mad. Got their attention. By 1813, just a year into the war, most of the American warships were bottled up in their ports by the British fleet. Who controls the seas? Great Britain. Making matters worse, Napoleon was temporarily defeated in 1814, which meant that Great Britain could now turn its full wrath against the upstart United States, a place that many people in England still called the colonies, which tells you all about the way they saw the world. And as I explained at the beginning of the lecture, the English planned a three-pronged invasion. One army coming down from Canada into New York, through Lake Champlain. A second army would attack the American capital, Washington, D.C., and then went on to Baltimore, where it was turned back. And then that third army would invade New Orleans and control the mouth of the Mississippi River and all American trade then coming down the Mississippi from the middle of the country. For whoever controls New Orleans and the Mississippi controls the center of North America. The British were beaten back, surprisingly, on Lake Champlain. That invasion force from Canada turned around. The American naval commander there on this big lake, Thomas McDonough, turned around the British, even though he lost his own warship, the Saratoga, which went to the bottom of the lake, but not before he'd beaten the British. And you already know about the attack on Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Now all that was left was the invasion of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is the hero of the War of 1812 and later a president of the United States. He would never have been president of the United States were it not for the fact that he was the hero of the War of 1812. So the two go together. Cause and effect. Before the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson had defeated the Creek Indians, who were allies of the British. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend. There's a Trivial Pursuit question, not a test question. Now he proceeds to New Orleans, and Jackson takes command of all the American forces defending the great port city of the Mississippi. The British commanding general was Edwin Pakenham. Pakenham was overconfident, as many British general and admiral officers were, and would be well into the future. Who are these upstart Americans anyway? What schools have they been to? Where have they studied the arts of war? Do they even know the first thing about Napoleon and strategy? No. So he takes his time arranging his forces for the attack, the siege of New Orleans. This allowed Old Hickory, that's Jackson's nickname, Old Hickory, the time he desperately needed to arrange for the defense of the city. Jackson now learned from spies that Pakenham planned a frontal assault through a narrow field. And there are swamps all around New Orleans, as I hope most of you know, and so the approaches to the city are not many. And this aids the defense. You can largely figure where the enemy is coming from, and Jackson does. And so now Jackson's men are prepared to give a good account of themselves behind the great bales of cotton and the earthworks that Jackson has put as a makeshift fort in the way of the British. As I said, Pakenham had contempt for Jackson's motley army. A bunch of mutts. I don't know about you Americans, but I'm proud to be a mutt. You know, crossbreed. Irish? Yeah. Thanks, Dad. Welsh? English? Mom. Who knows what else is in my blood? I'll bet there's not a single one of you who is a purebred anything. Check it out someday. You know, Ancestry.com. My wife, Duwamish Indian from the Puget Sound area. About a 16th, I think, maybe a 32nd. Yeah. So, we're all a bunch of mutts, aren't we? Pretty much. Where does any one of us get off with this idea of racism then? Adolf Hitler in the 20th century, the pure Aryan race, right? And if you weren't pure, you're not up at that top level. The Japanese, the same fallacy, pure Japanese blood, same period of time. They both look down on these Americans, right? Because we're not pure. I shouldn't have to tell you who in 1945 marched through Tokyo and Berlin. The mutts, the half-breeds, the unclean, the impure, the Americans. The British see the world in the same way. Perhaps not to that extreme of the Nazis and Imperial Japan, but certainly the same way. And of course, we Americans, the reason I'm saying this, white Americans, they got a goodly taste of that blood lust as well, don't we? Yeah. It's a fallacy, folks. So the Americans who are defending New Orleans are white frontiersmen with their Kentucky long rifles, and they are Creole aristocrats from New Orleans who don't want to see their city fall to the British. They are free blacks. Yes, New Orleans is a city that has thousands of free blacks. And they fight. They fight the British. And then, most interesting of all, a bunch of Jean Lafitte and his pirates joined Andrew Jackson to fight the British. Yes, Lafitte, the pirate of the Caribbean. You know, Pirates of the Caribbean, Disneyland. This is it. You see, the last thing Lafitte and the pirates wanted was for the British Navy to have a major naval outpost in New Orleans that would control the Caribbean and reduce the pirate trade. So Lafitte is going to bring his naval gunners to the defense of New Orleans. What a motley crew. Pakenham's veterans now advance through the mist with the bagpipes and the drums. It's an impressive sight. The morning air was torn by the sound of cannonballs as Lafitte's gunners plastered shell and shot on the advancing British. Still they came on, these British. They're veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. And so one man in front falls, and the next man steps up, and here they come. When the Americans could see the British redcoats, 1,000 muskets went off at once, and then another volley, and another volley, and another. And the British lines were just decimated. It was a slaughter. Pakenham himself was killed. Yes, a British general was killed in this battle. Commanding officer. And the Americans, in keeping with their tradition, no respect for gentlemen, for aristocrats. Of course, Pakenham was one of those, upper class. They recovered his body from the battlefield and realized at once who he was, uniform and such. And so they placed his body in a barrel of rum. And they sent it back to his ship, where his wife was waiting for his glorious return. The Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent and the end of the war. Weary of the war and its enormous expense, and having defeated the French, their primary foe. Remember that Napoleon had escaped from his imprisonment and had resurrected the French armies, and then finally met his final demise at the Battle of, in 1815, what? Waterloo. See, we all know Waterloo, but we don't know the context. I suspect we all still know Waterloo. This is a great defeat. It's where England defeats the French, Napoleon, Waterloo. You haven't had your Waterloo yet, have you? No. See? Part of our language. I hope you never do. And so now the British agreed to a treaty based on the status quo ante bellum. They've defeated the French. That was the main problem. Let's get rid of the American war. We never really hated the Americans that much anyway. Status quo ante bellum. That's Latin. Status quo. Things the way, ante bellum, the way they were before, before, bellum, Latin for war. Bellicose. Somebody is bellicose, you know they have an attitude. Ah! Yeah. Coaches in the middle of a hotly disputed game, they could be bellicose towards each other, right? Yeah, there you go. Language. Status quo, the way things were, ante, before, bellum, the war. That means that nothing was decided about neutral rights and free trade. That means nothing was decided about impressment. Status quo ante bellum. The Americans had to settle for protecting their nation's boundaries. However, because of the war, the British presence in the West, where they had been inciting the Indians and trading with the Indians, that was dramatically reduced. And then Tecumseh himself, the great Indian leader, was killed at the Battle of the Thames. And so now the Indian Federation begins to fall apart. Indian power is broken because of the war. Historians have long loved to note that the Battle of New Orleans came after the Treaty of Ghent was negotiated. After the ending of the war had been agreed upon. It had already taken place, but of course in those days, things travel at the speed of sail or horse, don't they? So it's going to take weeks for that news to get to North America. Generations of American school kids were taught that the battle was pointless because the treaty had already been negotiated. The author of the text that I used to use wrote, "The battle should never have been fought." Never have been fought. But in this claim, he makes an historian's mistake. A mistake of common sense or logic, if you will. The author allows himself a moment of anachronism. Anachronism. You can use this word to your advantage. The next time your mom or your dad says something that you find to be totally unrealistic and out of keeping with your generation, you can say, "Dad, that is so anachronistic. That's so old-fashioned." Then I would duck if I were you. Just kidding. That's my attempt to put it into real-life terms. Anachronism is an idea, event, or technology used improperly out of its time. Again, an idea, an event, or technology used improperly out of its time. There was no technology in 1814 that might have been used to communicate the Treaty of Ghent to the people in North America. It doesn't exist yet. How can you say then that the battle should not have been fought? It's anachronistic. You might as well say that at the Battle of Fort Necessity, George Washington would have won that battle against those evil French if he had had an F-16. Well, yeah. And every other general that ever lost a battle in history would have won that battle if they'd had an F-16 too. What's the point? It's stupid. Anachronism, see? By the way, F-16s are pretty much obsolete now. In addition to anachronism, the Battle of New Orleans confirmed the Treaty of Ghent, The treaty had not been ratified by either government yet when the Battle of New Orleans took place. They hadn't taken any votes on it or anything like that. It had just been negotiated in Ghent. If the British had taken New Orleans, they would surely have demanded renegotiation. Fruits of war, right? Yeah, absolutely they would have. So, it's even a poor point, even outside of anachronism. There were other results of this war. The Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson an American hero, with dramatic repercussions in the 1830s. It's because he is a military hero, the hero of the war, that Andrew Jackson becomes President of the United States in 1829. And Jackson is going to define the era, for good and bad. And finally, the Battle of New Orleans was the greatest American defeat of Britain in American history. And it gave the American people tremendous pride and self-confidence. Another result of the war. It is no wonder the War of 1812 is often called the Second War of Independence, because it establishes for good our independence from Great Britain. The war also helped unite the country. It led to what a great historian by the name of David Kennedy calls an upsurge of nationalism. An upsurge of nationalism. Now today in your world, that word nationalism in our modern media is generally considered a bad word. If you're nationalistic, you're probably too nationalistic, see. Because when nation states see themselves in nationalistic terms, they oftentimes see themselves as better than other nation states. This is exactly the kind of ideology that motivated both Japan and Germany in the Second World War. Ultra-nationalism, all right? On the other hand, if you don't have any nationalism whatsoever, then that can lead to dissolution of your state, you see. Or you are ripe for some kind of political takeover because you're not loyal to the nation state that you have. So like most things in life, there is a middle ground that is absolutely essential. And so there is an upsurge of nationalism as a result of this war that, frankly, the American people deeply needed at this time. That nationalism is not going to be up to the task in 1860, is it? When we are going to divide North and South, not enough nationalism. Southerners decide they want their own nation state, not loyal to the North, you see? And the issue, of course, was slavery. So you need some nationalism to hold together, but not so much that you see yourself as superior to other nation states and want to take them over. Questions? Yes?
So did the French have any involvement in the United States
At the time, no. The French are pretty much concerned with defeating Britain and its allies on the continent. Yeah, so this is a good example, though. We're fighting this war without allies, but there are other nations who are fighting against the British, okay? And a good thing for us. Anybody else? Other questions? Yes? Had the French, yeah, the French are out of, why is New Orleans in American hands? Because of Louisiana Purchase. Remember Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase? So it's our city by this time, okay? But that's at stake. Okay, good. Anybody, any other questions? Yes?
So the whole idea of impressment, there wasn't anything on the note guide, but will that be on the test?
Yeah, the idea of impressment is part of the causes of the war, okay? You should know what that means, okay?
What was the
Can you read it to me?
Yeah, it's just a contagion of.
Contagion of, no, okay, that's good. I forgot to mention this. So another historian, and I quoted Kennedy, okay, an upsurge of nationalism, but it's all about whether nationalism is a good thing or not. The word contagion, what does that mean? A virus, okay? Most of us would consider a virus to be a bad thing. So if you have a contagion of nationalism, that's the kind of nationalism that I was talking about that would become hyper-nationalism or ultra-nationalism that might lead to an attempt to subdue other peoples. And the historian that I was quoting there called this a contagion of nationalism. But again, I think he makes a mistake because that's not the situation at that time. Okay? I want you to guard against too much nationalism and too little. Oh, other than that, no problem, right? Okay, so what are the important concepts here that might be on the test?
Who's Andrew Jackson?
Yeah, absolutely. Who's Andrew Jackson? All right. Why is he important? So we already know one reason why. He leads American forces at the Battle of New Orleans, but we're going to add to that over the next few weeks. Okay. So Jackson is going to be our Washington-like figure for the next 2 weeks. All right, what else? Why was the Battle of New Orleans important? That's excellent, okay? What else? Absolutely going to be on the test. Yes? What was the causes of the war? In this case, there's 2 or 3, right? Okay, good. Anything else? What? Yeah, the results of the war would start with the Treaty of Ghent, see? Those are the classic results of the war, and then the results of the war might go beyond the treaty. So you should know what the Treaty of Ghent establishes. And then what I said right there at the end of the lecture about the upsurge of nationalism or the contagion of nationalism. Okay. Yes?
Who's James Madison?
Yeah, who's James Madison? Right, good. Madison is one of the most important of our founding fathers in the writing of the Constitution, but also as President of the United States. Okay. So yeah, he could be on the test. All right. Anybody else? What happened to Fort McHenry, right? Oh, and of course, everybody in the class should be able to recite the national anthem, right? Well, it's not going to be on the test, but it would certainly be a good thing. Okay. All right, could we go back to the early slides where I have my scriptures up there? Okay, so the Christian faith and learning. Before I decided to go to college for reals, I ran across some scriptures that stayed with me in my academic years. My first attempt at college, I was about your age. Most of you are in this class are 18, 19 years old. And so I decided to go to Oregon State University. The reason I went to Oregon State University was because that was a Pac-8 school. Yeah, Pac-12 today, but Pac-8 back in the dark ages. And the reason I wanted to go to Oregon State University was that I grew up reading the Oregonian newspaper, the sports pages in particular. And the Oregonian covered the University of Oregon and Oregon State University. In the 1960s, the University of Oregon was kind of a backwater for football. I know that's hard to imagine. They even had the same uniforms every week. Thank you. I did think that was funny. And Oregon State University was the power in Oregon, Oregon State. The Giant Killers in 1967. And so when I graduated from high school in 1973, I wanted to go to Oregon State University to play football. And that was why I was there, was to play sports, football in particular. And I was there during the summer of 1973-74, and I was participating in the informal workouts that were allowed at that time. And I think at some point I just kind of realized that I was too small and too slow and basically not talented enough to play for Oregon State University in 1973. Well, I went to school anyway for 2 quarters. And I tried to do the studies and the reading, but I had no real reason to be there, so I was not motivated. And so I got C's and B's and fell asleep trying to read books. I left after 2 quarters. Well, I went to Bend, Oregon to work for my dad in the restaurant that he owned there, and after about 8 or 9 years, I decided, I want to go back to school. I want to become probably a pastor and dedicate my life to Christ. Okay? And so I came to George Fox University to go to school. But I realized that I could not repeat. I needed a change of strategy. I could not repeat my strategy at Oregon State University. I needed to be serious. And I was worried. I had no thought that I had any kind of real talent for academics. The only time I'd ever challenged myself was in high school when my dad came to me, and I had like a 2.5 grade point average, and my dad said, he was really upset because I had dropped off, and he said, if you want to play football, and he knew how to get to me. You have my attention, Dad. You want to play football, you need a 3.01 grade point average, or you're not playing. There were words, and I stomped off. But when I graduated from high school, my GPA was 3.01, period. So, that's what I did. I don't, to this day, remember ever taking a book home to study for a test in high school. Not once. So I had to have a change of strategy. And I found some scriptures that let me think that if I prayed, that God would help me with this. And so I did. I prayed, and I remembered these scriptures, and I prayed for God's help every day. Pray every day, but I needed God's help every day. Well, I believe that God answered that prayer. I stand here today having gone through George Fox University, and I got the grades I needed to get to the University of Washington, where I did the master's in history and the PhD in history. I graduated near the top of my class at George Fox University, and I was in the top 3 or so of my graduating class in the PhD program at the University of Washington. But not because of anything I had that I had found in high school or in my first attempt at college. It was God's grace. Now, that does not mean that I didn't do the reading. It does not mean that I did not go to class. It does not mean that I did not get up early in the morning and study and apply myself. I did all those things. But God was gracious to me. So, you need some help. And who among us doesn't? The help is waiting there. Ask. Apply yourself. God bless you all.